3 completely different corners of the planet have been shaking within the same stretch of days, and none of them are connected to each other. Venezuela is still digging out from one of the deadliest earthquake disasters in modern South American history. Japan is riding out an aftershock sequence from a major quake that struck less than a month ago. And California, sitting directly on top of the most famous fault system in the world, keeps rattling with swarm after swarm of smaller tremors that never quite let anyone forget what's waiting underneath it. If you've been scrolling through headlines this week and felt like the entire planet has suddenly turned unstable, you're not imagining the volume of news. What you're actually seeing is 3 separate, unrelated stories reaching different stages at the exact same moment, a coincidence of timing rather than any kind of connected global event. Let's walk through each one, what's actually happening on the ground right now, and why seeing all 3 in your feed at once doesn't mean what it might feel like it means. Let's start with Venezuela, because what happened there back in June has quietly become one of the deadliest natural disasters anywhere on Earth this year. On June 24th, 2 massive earthquakes struck north-central Venezuela within 30 seconds of each other. The first, a magnitude 7.2, hit as a foreshock in Veros municipality west of San Felipe. 30 seconds later, a magnitude 7.5 main shock ripped through the coast near La Guaira, just west of Catia-la-Mar. The destruction was almost unimaginable. In La Guaira, state alone, roughly 80% of buildings collapsed. Caracas, the capital, absorbed severe damage as well, with more than 250 structures across the wider region destroyed or damaged badly enough to trap people inside as they collapsed, crushing vehicles and infrastructure across entire neighborhoods. Rescue crews spent the days immediately following the quake working through mountains of rubble, in many cases with limited heavy equipment, searching for survivors trapped beneath collapsed apartment buildings and homes. Entire blocks in the hardest-hit coastal communities were reduced to little more than debris fields, and officials warned early on that the search and recovery phase alone would likely stretch on for weeks. As of the most recent figures, more than 6,100 confirmed deaths have been reported, with roughly 61,000 people treated in hospitals and nearly 17,000 documented injuries. The United States Geological Survey's own damage estimation system, which models likely casualty ranges based on population density and shaking intensity, warned early on that the true death toll could climb well past 10,000 once every affected community is fully accounted for. An estimated 712,000 people were living in the municipalities that experienced the highest seismic intensity when the quakes struck. That's a staggering number of people caught directly in the most violent shaking a single earthquake sequence can produce, in a region that hadn't experienced anything of this scale in generations. The World Bank has placed the physical damage from this disaster at nearly $20 billion, an economic blow that would strain even a wealthy, stable economy, let alone one already dealing with the kind of prolonged hardship Venezuela has faced in recent years. Despite pledges of international support pouring in from around the world in the days after the quake, exactly where the funding for that scale of rebuilding will actually come from remains genuinely unclear. The Venezuelan government, led by interim President Delcy Rodriguez, has faced mounting public criticism over perceived shortcomings in the immediate emergency response, with residents in some of the hardest hit communities describing feeling abandoned during the critical early hours when search and rescue efforts were most urgent. That criticism has continued even as the broader humanitarian response has scaled up in the weeks since. The international response has extended well beyond government channels too. A benefit concert titled United for Our Own, held in Miami in mid-August, brought together more than 15 artists to raise funds for victims of both the Venezuela earthquakes and a separate related disaster across the border in Colombia, a reflection of just how widely this catastrophe has resonated across Latin American communities and the broader diaspora. If you're finding this kind of grounded, source-based disaster coverage useful, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of coverage reach more people who want the real story instead of a scary headline. 2 months later, the recovery effort in Venezuela is still very much underway. The latest humanitarian situation report, covering the period from August 18th through the 20th, confirms that response teams remain actively deployed across the affected states, continuing to deliver shelter, clean water, food assistance, and medical care to communities that are nowhere close to fully rebuilding. Health response teams alone have logged more than 34,000 medical consultations since the disaster struck, along with hundreds of surgeries and thousands of hospital bed days, according to the Pan American Health Organization. That kind of sustained medical demand, 2 full months after the actual earthquakes, gives you a real sense of just how deep and how long-lasting this crisis has become for the people living through it. Adding to the strain, a separate magnitude, 7.4 earthquake, struck western Colombia on August 10th near San Jose dels. Palmar, close enough to Venezuela's border region that it was felt widely across the country. While that quake wasn't part of the same fault system responsible for June's disaster, it landed on a population and a government response system that was already stretched to its absolute limit, dealing with an ongoing catastrophe just weeks old. To understand why Venezuela is even capable of producing an earthquake this destructive in the first place, you have to understand the tectonic setting the entire northern edge of South America sits on. This region straddles a genuinely complicated boundary zone, where the Caribbean plate grinds against the South American plate in a mostly sideways strike-slip motion, rather than the more commonly discussed head-on collisions you see elsewhere along the Pacific. That sideways motion is exactly what produced this pair of earthquakes. Strike-slip faults like these can rupture violently and suddenly, without the kind of long, gradual buildup that sometimes gives seismologists at least some warning signs beforehand. Venezuela has experienced destructive strike-slip earthquakes before, including a major event back in 2018, and clusters of smaller but still damaging quakes as recently as 2025, but nothing in living memory compares to the scale of what happened this June. Now let's shift across the Pacific to Japan, a country that lives with earthquakes as a daily reality more than almost anywhere else on the planet. On July 28th, a powerful magnitude 7.1 earthquake struck Kumamoto Prefecture on the southern island of Kyushu, with its epicenter roughly 12 miles south of Kumamoto City, a metropolitan area home to around 700,000 people. The Japan Meteorological Agency officially named this the 2026 Kumamoto earthquake, and it hit with enough force to register at the very highest level on Japan's seismic intensity scale in the hardest struck areas. At least 39 people were killed, and more than 350 others were injured, with roughly 300,000 residents across Kumamoto Prefecture instructed to seek shelter at evacuation centers in the immediate aftermath. The quake triggered building collapses across the region, including a shopping mall where an explosion, believed to have been caused by a gas leak following the earthquake, added an additional layer of danger and destruction to an already chaotic emergency response. Tens of thousands of homes lost power and running water in the hours and days that followed, and thousands of residents remained in emergency shelters as crews worked to restore basic services. Bullet train services connecting Fukuoka and other major cities across Kyushu were suspended in the immediate aftermath, stranding passengers at stations like on Hakata, as operators worked to inspect tracks and infrastructure for damage before resuming service. Tsunami advisories were briefly issued for the Ariake and Yatsushiro seas before being lifted later the same day, adding a tense few hours of uncertainty for coastal residents on top of everything else. Rescue teams, including specialized units from the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department, were deployed by helicopter to Kumamoto Prefecture within hours of the quake, focusing much of their initial effort on the collapsed shopping mall and other structures where people were believed trapped. Nearly 35,000 homes remained without electricity and around 15,000 without running water in the days that followed, according to localized officials, while more than 8,800 residents sought shelter across roughly 400 emergency centers. There's a haunting historical echo buried in this particular earthquake, too. Kumamoto experienced a devastating earthquake sequence back in 2016 that killed nearly 300 people and severely damaged the city's famous historic castle, a beloved tourist landmark. Japanese researchers investigating this newest quake found something remarkable in the geology, evidence that a fault segment left unbroken during that 2016 sequence, sometimes called a slip gap or a remaining fault patch, appears to have finally ruptured this time around, a decade later. That detail matters enormously to seismologists because it's a rare, direct, documented example of a fault segment that stayed locked and stressed for years after a major earthquake sequence nearby, only to eventually release that pent-up stress in a completely separate event, roughly 10 years down the line. It's exactly the kind of evidence scientists rely on to better understand how stress transfers and lingers across interconnected fault networks. Japan's Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, urged residents in the affected region to remain vigilant for the possibility of another earthquake of similar magnitude in the days following the disaster, a caution rooted in hard experience. Japan sits directly on what's commonly called the Ring of Fire, the horseshoe-shaped belt of volcanoes and deep ocean trenches that wraps around the edges of the Pacific Ocean and produces the overwhelming majority of the world's earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Nearly 20% of all earthquakes worldwide measuring magnitude, 6 or higher, occur in or around Japan alone, a statistic that reflects just how directly this densely populated island nation sits atop some of the most seismically active plate boundaries on the entire planet. The Pacific Plate is constantly diving, or subducting, beneath the smaller Okhotsk microplate along Japan's eastern and southern coastlines, building up enormous stress that eventually has to release somewhere. Japan's building codes and emergency response systems rank among the most sophisticated in the world, largely built and refined in direct response to decades of hard-earned experience with major earthquakes, including the catastrophic 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, which killed nearly 20,000 people and triggered meltdowns at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. That institutional memory almost certainly helped limit the death toll from this most recent Kumamoto event, compared to what a similarly powerful quake might produce in a less prepared country. That constant background tension explains why, even weeks after the main Kumamoto earthquake, the region and the wider Japanese archipelago have continued rattling with a steady stream of aftershocks and unrelated smaller quakes. A magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck off Hachinohe in northern Japan on August 9th, and by mid-August, additional moderate earthquakes in the magnitude 4 to 5 range had struck near Kyoto, near Sendai, and off the coast, near Fukuoka, a reminder of just how continuously active this entire stretch of the Pacific remains. As recently as this week, a magnitude 5.4 earthquake struck near Tateyama, and a magnitude 4.5 event hit the remote Bonin Islands south of Tokyo. None of these individually rank as catastrophic, but taken together, they paint a picture of a region where the ground essentially never stops moving in some form or another, whether people notice it or not. Now let's turn to California, the third piece of this global pattern, and arguably the one American viewers are most personally curious about. Unlike Venezuela or Japan, California hasn't experienced a single major, headline-grabbing earthquake this particular week. What it has experienced is something seismologists actually pay very close attention to for a completely different reason: a persistent stream of smaller earthquake swarms scattered across the state. Over the past 2 weeks alone, California has recorded dozens of earthquakes in the magnitude 2 to 4.5 range, scattered across locations from Covelo in the north to San Benito County, from the Bay Area near San Leandro to Southern California communities like Ontario and Atascadero. None of these individually caused significant damage, but the sheer density and frequency of this activity is exactly the kind of pattern California seismologists track continuously. Most residents in the affected areas likely never even felt the majority of these tremors, since many registered below magnitude 3, the rough threshold at which shaking typically becomes noticeable to people standing still indoors. But seismic networks operated by Caltech, UC Berkeley, and the United States Geological Survey recorded every single one, feeding continuous data into models researchers use to track exactly how stress is distributed across California's dense web of interconnected faults. That tracking matters because California sits directly on top of the San Andreas Fault system, the boundary where the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate slide past each other at a steady rate of roughly 46 millimeters per year. That's the same basic strike-slip motion responsible for Venezuela's devastating June earthquakes just occurring at a dramatically slower, more gradual pace along a fault system that's been extensively studied for well over a century. California has gone through recent stretches of exactly this kind of clustered minor activity before, including earthquake swarms near Indio in the Coachella Valley earlier this year, and a notable cluster of tremors that shook the Bay Area back in February, the largest of which reached magnitude 4.2. Seismologists studying these swarms consistently emphasize that most earthquake sequences like this simply run their course without producing anything larger. But each one still gets carefully logged and analyzed for what it reveals about stress building along nearby fault segments. That careful monitoring exists because of what's sometimes casually called the big one. The long-anticipated major rupture scientists know is eventually coming somewhere along California's fault network. Given how much stress has been quietly accumulating along certain segments for well over a century without a major release, nobody can predict exactly when or where that eventual rupture will occur. But persistent background seismicity like this week's swarms is part of the ongoing data set researchers use to understand how stress is distributed across the system right now. Seismologists are careful to emphasize a point that often gets lost in casual conversation about the big one, that a swarm of small, scattered earthquakes doesn't actually make a major rupture any more or less likely in the immediate future. Each small quake does release some stress along its own tiny patch of fault, but the vast majority of California's accumulated seismic stress remains locked deep underground, far beyond what these minor tremors are capable of relieving. The weighting, in that sense, continues largely unaffected by weeks like this one. If you want to understand why these three completely different regions can all be shaking at the same time without any of it actually being connected, the answer comes down to basic global seismology, and it's honestly less mysterious than it might feel watching all three stories unfold at once. Earthquakes of magnitude 6 or higher happen somewhere on Earth roughly 100 times a year on average. Smaller earthquakes happen constantly, virtually, every single day, somewhere across the planet's vast, interconnected network of tectonic plate boundaries. Venezuela's earthquakes trace back to the Caribbean plate grinding against the South American plate. Japan's earthquakes trace back to the Pacific plate, subducting beneath the Okhotsk microplate along the Ring of Fire. California's tremors trace back to the Pacific plate, sliding past the North American plate, along the San Andreas system. 3 entirely separate plate boundaries, 3 entirely separate mechanisms, with absolutely no physical connection between what's happening beneath any one of these regions and what's happening beneath the others. It's worth being direct about something scientists studying global seismicity data have repeatedly confirmed. There is no credible evidence that earthquakes in one part of the world trigger or influence earthquakes on a completely separate tectonic plate thousands of miles away. The idea feels intuitive, especially when 3 dramatic stories land in the same news cycle, but the physical distances and completely separate stress systems involved make any real connection scientifically implausible. What makes weeks like this one feel so dramatic isn't some hidden global connection scientists are somehow missing. It's simply the natural, ongoing background rhythm of a planet covered in constantly shifting tectonic plates, occasionally producing headline-worthy events in multiple places, close enough together in time that it feels like the whole planet is shaking at once. Earlier this same week, a magnitude 7.7 earthquake also struck near Enda in Indonesia's East Nusa Tenggara region, another entirely separate segment of the same broader Ring of Fire system that includes Japan. That Indonesian earthquake barely made headlines outside the immediate region, despite being nearly as powerful as the quake that devastated parts of Japan just weeks. Earlier, a reminder that global media attention doesn't always track cleanly with actual seismic magnitude or destructive potential. Indonesia itself sits at the convergence of several major tectonic plates and regularly experiences earthquakes of this scale, most of which never reach international audiences the way this week's overlapping stories have. That kind of overlap happens more often than most people realize, simply because Earth is an enormous, constantly active planet with dozens of major fault systems, all releasing stress on their own independent timelines. Humans are naturally wired to notice patterns and connections, even when the underlying science shows there genuinely isn't one linking these specific events together. A social media feed that surfaces 3 dramatic earthquake stories in the same scroll session can make an ordinary week of global seismicity feel like an unprecedented crisis, even when the actual underlying numbers fall well within historical norms. Psychologists who study risk perception have a name for this tendency, sometimes called clustering illusion, the very human habit of seeing meaningful patterns in essentially random timing. It's the same mental shortcut that makes a string of coincidences feel significant, even when the underlying probability of several independent events lining up within the same week or two is actually fairly ordinary once you account for how many earthquakes happen globally every single day. None of that makes any of these individual disasters any less real or any less devastating for the people actually living through them. Venezuela's earthquake response remains one of the largest ongoing humanitarian operations anywhere in the world right now, months after the actual shaking stopped. Japan's Kumamoto region is still working through the physical and emotional aftermath of a quake that echoed a decade-old tragedy in the exact same city. And California continues its permanent, quiet vigil over a fault system everyone knows is capable of producing something far larger than this week's scattered swarms. Subscribe so you don't miss the next update the moment any of these situations develop. Further, because between an ongoing recovery effort in South America, an active aftershock sequence in Japan, and persistent background seismicity along one of the most studied fault systems on Earth, this is exactly the kind of global pattern worth continuing to watch closely. We'll keep tracking all 3 stories as they unfold, along with anything new that develops elsewhere around the world's fault lines in the days ahead. For now, communities across 3 continents are living with the direct, tangible consequences of a planet whose crust simply never stops moving. Venezuela buries its dead and rebuilds its coastline. Japan reinforces buildings and watches for the next aftershock. And California keeps recording tremor after tremor, each one a small data point in an enormous, patient, ongoing story about the ground beneath all of our feet, and just how little control any of us truly have over when and where it decides to move next. 3 separate stories, 3 separate timelines, and one shared reminder that this planet has never once stopped shifting beneath us, whether we happen to be paying attention or not.